May 16, 1943. A moonlit spring evening settled over RAF Scampton in Lincolnshire, England, and across the airfield, 19 Lancaster bombers stood waiting in the gathering dusk. Their silhouettes appeared strange, almost deformed. The bomb bay doors had been removed, exposing cylindrical drums that rotated slowly beneath each aircraft's belly. 133 young men, aviators from Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, prepared to embark on one of the most audacious and dangerous missions of the Second World War. They would fly deep into enemy territory at barely 60 feet above the ground, racing through darkness toward 3 massive dams that held back millions of tons of water in Germany's industrial heartland. The weapon they carried had never been used in combat before. Many in the British military establishment had dismissed it as impossible. German engineers believed their dams were unbreakable. In less than 8 hours, both assumptions would be proven catastrophically wrong. The story of this night began not in the skies over Germany, but in the back garden of a modest English home more than a year earlier. Barnes Wallis, assistant chief designer at Vickers Armstrongs, was a tall, angular man with an engineer's methodical mind and an inventor's restless imagination. Throughout 1942, while Britain struggled through the darkest days of the war, Wallis had become consumed by a problem that seemed to have no solution. The Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heart, was protected by massive dams that provided water for steel production, coal washing, and hydroelectric power generation. Destroying those dams could cripple German war production for months. But conventional bombing had proven ineffective. The dams were too massive, too thick, too well defended. Torpedo nets stretched across the reservoirs, preventing underwater attack. Anti-aircraft guns ringed the structures, making high-altitude bombing suicidal. And even if a bomb could be placed near the dam, the sheer mass of reinforced concrete, in some places more than 100 feet thick, would absorb the blast. Wallis had initially conceived of his weapon in the context of naval warfare, imagining a bomb that could skip across water to strike enemy battleships below their armor belt. The fundamental physics intrigued him. Objects traveling at high speed across water could bounce, each impact dissipating less energy than the last, until the object reached its target. But how to weaponize this principle? Wallis began his experiments with the simplest possible tools. Marbles bounced across a washtub in his back garden. His daughter would later recall watching her father spend hours measuring trajectories, adjusting angles, calculating velocities with a slide rule and notebook. The neighbors must have thought him mad. This middle-aged engineer playing with children's toys while the world burned around them. But Wallis was pursuing something that existed at the intersection of physics, engineering, and desperation. By spring of 1942, Wallis had moved beyond marbles to small-scale prototypes, working in conjunction with scientists from the Road Research Laboratory at Harmondsworth. Dr. A.R. Collins, a scientific officer at the laboratory, had been conducting parallel research into underwater explosions. Collins had discovered something that would prove crucial. An explosive charge detonated in direct contact with a solid surface underwater would have exponentially greater destructive power than one detonated even a few feet away. The water itself acted as a tamping medium, focusing the explosive force against the target rather than dissipating it in all directions. This insight transformed Wallis's thinking. His weapon would not simply need to reach the dam. It would need to sink down the upstream face and detonate in direct contact with the masonry, 30 feet below the surface where the water pressure would magnify the blast effect. Through the spring and summer of 1942, Wallis refined his design through an increasingly complex series of tests. In May, he traveled to the Elon Valley in Wales, where a small disused dam called WWII stood as a potential test site. The first attempts were spectacular failures. Charges detonated against the dam wall, sending geysers of water skyward and rattling windows in villages miles away, but leaving the structure fundamentally intact. Wallis returned to his calculations, working 18-hour days, filling notebook after notebook with equations. He consulted with Collins, with structural engineers, with explosives experts. The breakthrough came in July 1942. A mine containing 279 pounds of explosive was suspended by scaffolding at the precise midpoint of the WWII Dam, positioned 30 feet below the surface, directly against the upstream face. The detonation, carried out by remote control, produced a result that exceeded even Wallis's most optimistic projections. The small dam, 180 feet long, was completely destroyed, a massive breach opening in its center as millions of gallons of water thundered down the valley below. Wallis stood on the hillside watching the torrent, and for the first time allowed himself to believe that his weapon might actually work. But one critical problem remained: how to deliver such a weapon accurately from an aircraft traveling at high speed. The bomb would need to be dropped from exactly 60 feet above the water. Any higher and it would shatter on impact. Any lower and it would sink immediately without bouncing. The aircraft would need to maintain a precise speed of 232 miles per hour. Too fast and the bomb would skip over the dam. Too slow and it would sink short of the target. And the weapon itself would need to be spinning backwards at 500 revolutions per minute when it was released. This backspin served two crucial functions. It would help the bomb maintain its trajectory across the water, and once it struck the dam wall, the residual spin would drive the weapon down the upstream face, rolling it along the masonry until it reached the optimal detonation depth. The technical challenges seemed insurmountable. Wallis faced institutional resistance at nearly every turn. Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, commander of RAF Bomber Command, was deeply skeptical. Harris had been waging a campaign of area bombing against German cities, sending hundreds of heavy bombers on nightly raids designed to break civilian morale and destroy industrial capacity through sheer tonnage of high explosive and incendiary bombs. The idea of diverting resources, aircraft, crews, bombs, training time, to attack 3 dams with a weapon that had never been combat-tested struck Harris as a dangerous distraction. He referred to Wallis's proposals as a madcap scheme. Other senior officers shared his concerns. Precision bombing had proven extraordinarily difficult. Even in daylight, with clear weather and no opposition, bombers frequently missed their targets by hundreds of yards. The notion that crews could hit a target as small as a dam wall, at night, flying at 60 feet above the water while under anti-aircraft fire, seemed like fantasy. But Wallis was relentless. He wrote papers, delivered presentations, conducted demonstrations, badgered anyone who would listen. He brought his case to Air Chief Marshal Sir Charles Portal, Chief of the Air Staff and the senior officer of the Royal Air Force. Portal reviewed the evidence, the successful test at Nant-Wigro, the calculations showing the potential impact on German war production, the operational plan that Wallis had meticulously developed. On February 26, 1943, Portal made his decision. The operation would proceed. The weapon, now officially codenamed Upkeep, would be developed for immediate deployment. On March 17, just 2 months before the planned attack date, Portal issued orders for the formation of a new squadron specifically tasked with carrying out the raid. Wallis had just 8 weeks to finalize his weapon and prepare it for combat. The man chosen to lead this new squadron was Wing Commander Guy Gibson, just 24 years old, but already a veteran of more than 170 combat missions. Gibson had flown bombers and night fighters since the early days of the war, earning a reputation as a skilled pilot and a demanding commander who expected from his crews the same relentless dedication he demanded from himself. He was not universally liked. Some found him cold, obsessive, more concerned with results than with the men who achieved them. But no one questioned his competence or his courage. Portal's instructions to Gibson were characteristically direct. Assemble a squadron, train them to fly at night at extremely low altitude with pinpoint precision, and prepare them to attack targets that would not be revealed until immediately before takeoff. Gibson had 3 weeks to recruit his aircrews and begin training. The squadron that Gibson assembled at RAF Scampton was designated 617 Squadron, though in its earliest days it was known simply as Squadron X, its true purpose hidden even from most of its own members. Gibson handpicked some of his aviators, men he had flown with before, pilots and navigators and bomb aimers whose skill he knew firsthand. Others were assigned to the squadron by Bomber Command, crews who had completed their first tour of operations or were about to begin their second. They came from across the Commonwealth and the English-speaking world. Flight Lieutenant John Hoppy Hopgood, a young Englishman who had already earned the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions over Germany. Pilot Officer Les Knight from Australia, quiet and methodical, renowned among his peers for his precision flying. Flying Officer Joe McCarthy, an American who had joined the Royal Canadian Air Force before the United States entered the war. A massive man whose physical strength and fierce determination were legendary. Flight Lieutenant David Maltby, Flight Lieutenant Henry Maudsley, Pilot Officer Jeff Rice, young men, none older than 30, all volunteers, all aware that they had been selected for something dangerous but ignorant of what that mission would be. Training began immediately, and it was unlike anything the crews had experienced before. Conventional bomber operations were conducted at altitudes of 15,000 feet or higher, where anti-aircraft fire was less accurate and the oxygen-thin air provided some measure of safety. But Gibson's training regime demanded that his pilots fly their 4-engine Lancaster bombers, aircraft that weighed 30 tons when fully loaded, at heights so low that they skimmed treetops and power lines. Night after night, the Lancasters roared across the English countryside in the darkness, terrifying farmers and villagers who woke to the thunderous howl of Rolls-Royce Merlin engines passing barely 100 feet overhead. The pilots practiced holding precise altitudes and airspeeds. Navigators refined their ability to locate small features in darkness using nothing but moonlight and dead reckoning. Bomb aimers trained to identify targets in the split second before their aircraft passed overhead. The training was conducted primarily at the Derwent Reservoir in Derbyshire, whose dam bore a superficial resemblance to one of the eventual targets, though the crews did not know this. Security was absolute. The air crews were forbidden from discussing their training with anyone outside the squadron. Letters home were carefully censored. Leave was restricted. Even within 617 Squadron, only Gibson and a handful of senior officers knew the true targets. The ordinary crew members, the flight engineers who monitored the aircraft systems, the wireless operators who maintained radio contact, the rear gunners who sat alone in their turrets scanning the darkness for enemy fighters, trained with an intensity driven by ignorance and trust. They did not know where they were going or what they would attack, but they understood that they were being prepared for something unprecedented. While the aircrews trained, Roy Chadwick and his engineering team at Avro, the company that manufactured the Lancaster bomber, worked desperately to modify 19 aircraft to carry upkeep. The modifications were extensive and complex. The bomb bay doors were removed entirely, exposing the enormous drum-shaped weapon that would be mounted laterally across the aircraft's underside. A hydraulic motor and belt drive system was installed to rotate the bomb at precisely 500 revolutions per minute before release. Spotlights were fitted to the underside of the aircraft, angled so that when their beams converged on the water surface, the pilot would know he was at exactly 60 feet altitude, a crude but effective altimeter for low-level flight. The modifications added weight and drag, reducing the Lancaster's already modest speed and making the aircraft even more vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. Meanwhile, Wallis and his team at Vickers struggled to manufacture the bombs themselves. Each upkeep weighed 9,600 pounds and was filled with 6,600 pounds of high explosive. The outer casing had to be perfectly cylindrical, machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, or the weapon would tumble erratically when released. By early May, with less than 2 weeks remaining before the scheduled attack date, only a handful of upkeeps had been completed. Production continued around the clock, machinists and assembly workers laboring in shifts, knowing that men's lives would depend on the precision of their work. The targets were selected based on a combination of military necessity and operational feasibility. The Möhne Dam, located in the Ruhr Valley approximately 30 miles east of Dusseldorf, was the primary objective. This massive curved gravity dam, 650 meters long and 40 meters high, held back the Möhne Sea, a reservoir containing more than 130 million cubic meters of water. That water was essential to Ruhr industrial production. It was used in steel mills, coal washeries, and hydroelectric power stations. Destroying the Möhne would cause immediate and catastrophic disruption. The Eder Dam, approximately 50 miles to the southeast, was nearly as large and fed the Eder River, which eventually flowed into the Weser and provided water to keep the Mittelland Canal navigable for barge traffic carrying coal and steel. The third target, the Sorp Dam, was a different type of structure, an earthen dam with a concrete core, and would require a different attack method. 3 additional dams, the Yanipe, Lister, and Daimel, were designated as secondary targets to be attacked if bombs remained after the primary objectives were destroyed. Each dam presented unique challenges. The Möhne's reservoir was surrounded by tree-covered hills, But the approach to the dam itself was relatively clear, allowing aircraft to line up their attack run from several miles away. However, the dam was heavily defended by anti-aircraft guns mounted in towers on either side of the structure. Crews would be flying directly into enemy fire for the final minute of their approach. The Eder was in many ways even more difficult. Its winding reservoir was bordered by steep hills that rose almost vertically from the water's edge. The only viable approach was from the north, requiring aircraft to dive sharply, level out barely above the water surface, release their bomb, and then pull up immediately to avoid crashing into the hills on the far side of the reservoir. And unlike the Möhne, which sat in a relatively populated area where moonlight reflecting off the water would provide some visual reference, the Eder was remote and shrouded in mist that could make it nearly impossible to see the target until the last moment. The SORP presented different problems. Its earthen construction meant that upkeep strategy of detonating against a solid masonry wall would be less effective. Aircraft attacking the SORP would need to fly along the length of the dam, rather than approaching perpendicular to it, and release their bombs to skip and then sink next to the structure. On the afternoon of May 16th, the day of the raid, Gibson finally revealed the targets to his assembled crews. The briefing took place in the operations room at Scampton, and as Gibson pulled away the covers from the maps and aerial photographs mounted on the walls, a murmur ran through the room. After 8 weeks of relentless training, after hundreds of practice runs over English reservoirs, the young aviators now understood what they had been preparing for. Barnes Wallis himself attended the briefing, explaining the principle of the bouncing bomb and demonstrating with models how the weapon would function. He spoke with passion about the potential impact of the mission, but also with a scientist's precision about the exact parameters that must be maintained: the altitude, the airspeed, the rotation rate of the bomb, the precise distance from the dam wall at which the weapon must be released. He could not minimize the dangers. The crews would be flying at night, at an altitude where a moment's inattention or a small navigational error could send a 30-ton bomber smashing into a hillside or crashing into a reservoir. They would face anti-aircraft fire at point-blank range. They would be over enemy territory for hours, vulnerable to German night fighters. When Wallis finished speaking, Gibson asked if anyone had questions. There were none. The crews filed out to their aircraft. At 21 minutes past 9 on the evening of May 16, 1943, Gibson's Lancaster, identified by the code letters AJG, roared down Scampton's runway and lifted into the twilight sky. The first wave of 9 aircraft followed at 10-minute intervals, navigating by moonlight across England toward the North Sea coast. A second wave of 5 aircraft took off shortly afterward, assigned to attack the SORP dam. A third wave of 5 aircraft would take off later to serve as a reserve, ready to be directed against any target that the first 2 waves failed to destroy. The Lancasters flew low, barely above the wave tops as they crossed the North Sea, their propellers throwing spray as they raced toward the Dutch coast. They crossed into occupied Europe near the Scheldt estuary, then turned southeast, following a carefully planned route that avoided known anti-aircraft positions and German fighter bases. The aircraft flew separately now, no longer in formation, each crew navigating independently toward the rendezvous point south of the Möhne Dam. The flight across Germany was terrifying. At an altitude of less than 100 feet, the countryside flashed past in a blur. Trees, church steeples, power lines, buildings. Everything appeared suddenly in the darkness and vanished just as quickly behind them. Several aircraft encountered anti-aircraft fire from alert German gunners who heard the Lancasters passing overhead. Pilot Officer Jeff Rice flew too low over the Zuiderzee. His Lancaster struck the water, tearing off the upkeep bomb and nearly destroying the aircraft. Rice fought for control and managed to keep the bomber airborne, but with his weapon gone and damage to the aircraft structure, he had no choice but to abort the mission and return to England. Flight Lieutenant Bill Estelle was less fortunate. His Lancaster struck high-tension power lines near the German town of Marbeck and exploded in a fireball that killed all 7 crew members instantly. Flight Lieutenant Henry Maudslay's aircraft was hit by flak as it crossed the Rhine, but Maudslay kept flying, the damaged Lancaster trailing smoke as it continued toward the target. Gibson reached the Möhne Dam just after midnight. He circled once, assessing the target in the moonlight, then radioed the other aircraft in his wave to begin their attack runs. Gibson himself would attack first, flying directly at the dam from the north while the German anti-aircraft guns opened fire. The two gun towers on either side of the dam sparkled with muzzle flashes as tracer rounds arced upward, converging on the approaching Lancaster. Gibson's bomb aimer, Flying Officer Frederick Spafford, lay in the aircraft's nose, watching through the bomb sight as the massive concrete wall grew larger with each passing second. At the precise moment when the spotlights beneath the aircraft converged on the water surface, Spafford pressed the release button. The upkeep dropped away, spinning backwards at 500 revolutions per minute, struck the water, bounced once, twice, 3 times, and disappeared beneath the surface just yards from the dam wall. Gibson pulled up sharply, clearing the dam by mere feet, the Lancaster shuddering as flak bursts erupted around it. Behind him, a massive geyser of water erupted as the upkeep detonated 30 feet below the surface. But when the spray cleared, the dam remained intact. Flight Lieutenant John Hopgood attacked next. As his Lancaster, AJM, began its attack run, German gunners concentrated their fire on the approaching bomber. Tracer rounds stitched across the aircraft's fuselage, igniting fuel and hydraulic lines. The Lancaster was burning as it raced toward the dam, flames streaming from its port wing. Hopgood's bomb aimer, Flying Officer John Fraser, released the upkeep, but the aircraft was too high and traveling too fast. The bomb bounced over the dam and exploded on the power station on the far side, destroying the building in a blast that killed everyone inside. Hopgood tried desperately to gain altitude, but the stricken Lancaster was losing power. He ordered his crew to bail out, and 3 men, Fraser, the rear gunner, and the front gunner, managed to escape before the aircraft crashed into the ground 2 miles beyond the dam and exploded. Hopgood and the 3 crew members still aboard were killed instantly. Flight Lieutenant Harold Martin attacked third, his Lancaster weaving and jinking to throw off the German gunner's aim. His bomb struck the water and bounced perfectly toward the dam, detonating against the wall in a tremendous explosion. But again, when the water settled, the massive structure stood firm. Squadron leader Henry Young attacked fourth with the same result. A perfect drop, a massive explosion, no breach. Gibson watched from his orbiting Lancaster as bomb after bomb struck the Möhne without breaking it, and he began to fear that Wallis's weapon might fail after all. Then Flight Lieutenant David Maltby began his approach. By now the German gunners had found their range, and flak was bursting continuously around the dam. But Maltby held his Lancaster steady, flying straight and level through the storm of fire. His bomb aimer released the upkeep at precisely the correct point. The cylindrical weapon skipped across the water, struck the dam wall, and sank. The explosion that followed was different. Deeper, more sustained, a rumbling that seemed to shake the earth. And then, slowly at first but with gathering speed, a section of the Möhne Dam 250 feet wide simply collapsed. A wall of water 30 feet high burst through the gap and thundered down the valley toward the Ruhr River below. Gibson immediately radioed the code word "nigger" back to Bomber Command Headquarters. The Möhne had been breached. He directed the remaining aircraft in his wave, now no longer needed at the Möhne, to proceed to the secondary target, the Eder Dam. The flight to the Eder took approximately 20 minutes, and as the Lancasters approached the reservoir, they discovered conditions even worse than anticipated. Mist shrouded the valley, and the surrounding hills were so steep and so close that the bomb aimers could barely see the dam until their aircraft were practically on top of it. Flight Lieutenant David Shannon made the first attack run, diving into the valley and racing toward the dam, but at the last moment realized his approach angle was wrong and pulled up without releasing his bomb. He circled and tried again with the same result, aborting his third attempt as well. Flight Lieutenant Henry Maudslay, flying the damaged Lancaster that had been hit earlier, attempted his attack run but misjudged the distance and released his upkeep too late. The bomb bounced over the dam and exploded on the downstream side, the blast so close to Maudslay's aircraft that it was caught in the shockwave and severely damaged. Maudslay struggled to keep the Lancaster flying as he turned for home, but German night fighters found the crippled bomber and shot it down before it could reach the North Sea. All 7 crew members died. Les Knight, the young Australian pilot, made his approach carefully, dropping low over the hills and then diving almost vertically into the valley. his Lancaster leveled out just feet above the water, the aircraft's propellers throwing spray, the wings nearly scraping the hillsides on either side. Knight's bomb aimer released the upkeep at the perfect moment. The weapon bounced cleanly across the reservoir, struck the dam, sank, and exploded. The Eder Dam, undefended by anti-aircraft guns but protected by its natural fortress of steep hills, broke. A section of the wall collapsed, and another massive flood poured down the valley toward the town of Castle miles to the east. The time was 52 minutes past 1 in the morning of May 17th. Meanwhile, the second wave of 5 aircraft assigned to attack the Sorp Dam had been experiencing difficulties. Flight Lieutenant Robert Barlow's Lancaster struck trees while flying at low altitude over Germany and crashed, killing all aboard. Flight Lieutenant Louis Burpee's aircraft was shot down by German night fighters. Pilot Officer Vernon Byers became lost in darkness and fog and returned to base without finding the target. Of the 5 aircraft in the second wave, only 2, flown by Flight Lieutenant Joe McCarthy and Pilot Officer Ken Brown, successfully reached the Sorp. Both made multiple attack runs, releasing their upkeeps against the earthen dam, but the structure's design made it far more resistant to explosion than the gravity dams. They succeeded in damaging the Sorp but not breaching it. The final aircraft of the night was piloted by Flight Sergeant Cyril Anderson, part of the reserve wave that had been held back until needed. Anderson was directed to attack the Eder Dam as a backup, but by the time he arrived, the Eder had already been destroyed. He diverted to a secondary target, one of the smaller dams designated in the original plan, but was unable to locate it in the darkness. He brought his upkeep home, one of the few aircraft to return with its weapons still aboard. The last Lancaster touched down at RAF Scampton at 4 minutes past 6 on the morning of May 17th, completing a mission that had lasted nearly 9 hours. In the operations room, Gibson and his surviving crew members were debriefed while photographs taken during the attack were developed and analyzed. The toll had been severe. Of the 19 aircraft that had taken off the previous evening, only 11 had returned. 8 Lancasters and 53 men were gone. 3 additional crew members had survived the loss of their aircraft but were now prisoners of war in German camps. For 617 Squadron, the loss rate was more than 40%, a level of casualties that would be unsustainable in any sustained operation. But the damage they had inflicted was extraordinary. In the valleys below the shattered Möhne Dam, a tsunami of water had spread across the landscape. The initial wave, 30 feet high and traveling at 15 miles per hour, destroyed everything in its path. Villages were swept away. Factories collapsed. Roads, bridges, and railway lines disappeared beneath the flood. The torrent spread more than 50 miles from the source, inundating the confluence of the Möhne and Ruhr rivers and devastating the town of Neum, where more than 800 people drowned. The Eder's flood was less destructive because it flowed east toward less densely populated areas, but it still caused significant damage to the town of Castle and disrupted water supplies throughout the region. In total, at least 1,650 people were killed by the floods. More than 1,000 of those victims were foreign prisoners of war and forced laborers held in camps below the dams. Men and women from the Soviet Union, Poland, and Ukraine, imprisoned by the Nazi regime and left to die when the water came. The human cost of the raid was appalling on both sides. The industrial impact, while significant, was less than the British had hoped. Steel production in the Ruhr dropped to a quarter of its pre-raid level, but German engineers worked with desperate speed to repair the damage. 7,000 construction workers were diverted to the Möhne and Eder dams, and temporary repairs were completed within weeks. By September, both dams had been fully restored. Coal production fell by 400,000 tons in the month following the attack, a serious but not crippling blow. 2 major power stations were completely destroyed, and 7 others were damaged, resulting in a loss of electrical power throughout the region for 2 weeks. Approximately 92 houses were destroyed outright, 971 others damaged. 11 small factories were obliterated, and 114 others sustained damage. Thousands of acres of agricultural land were ruined by flooding and silt deposition. In his post-war memoir, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, acknowledged the raid's potential. That night, employing just a few bombers, The British came close to a success which would have been greater than anything they had achieved hitherto with a commitment of thousands of bombers, Spear wrote. But he also noted a critical Allied failure. Bomber Command never followed up the initial attack with conventional raids while the dams were being repaired. Barnes Wallis himself expressed profound frustration about this missed opportunity. He had argued strenuously that even a few high-explosive bombs dropped on the breached dams during reconstruction would have prevented their repair for months, potentially extending the disruption to German war production indefinitely. But Harris and the senior leadership of Bomber Command were focused on their campaign of area bombing against German cities, and resources were not allocated for follow-up attacks on the dams. The psychological and propaganda impact of the raid far exceeded its immediate military effect. In Britain, where the population had endured years of rationing, blackouts, and the constant fear of German bombing, the Dambusters raid was celebrated as a brilliant victory. Newspapers carried dramatic photographs of the breached Möhne Dam, water still pouring through the massive gap in its wall. Gibson and his surviving crew members were treated as heroes. Gibson himself was awarded the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest decoration for valor. 33 other members of 617 Squadron received decorations ranging from the Distinguished Service Order to the Distinguished Flying Medal. The raid demonstrated that precision bombing was possible, that carefully trained crews using specialized weapons could strike targets that conventional bombing could never destroy. It showed Britain's allies, particularly the United States and the Soviet Union, that the Royal Air Force was capable of extraordinary feats of arms. It forced Germany to divert resources to air defense and dam protection that might otherwise have been used on the fighting fronts. For the German population, particularly in the Ruhr Valley, the raid was a catastrophe that the Nazi propaganda machine struggled to explain away. Germans immediately referred to it as the Möhne catastrophe. The fact that British bombers had struck so deep into German territory, destroying structures that German engineers had proclaimed invulnerable, was a profound psychological blow. The floods killed more German civilians than any previous RAF raid. The disruption to daily life, the loss of electrical power, the contamination of water supplies, the destruction of transportation infrastructure, reminded the German people that their homeland was no longer safe from attack. 617 Squadron continued operations throughout the remainder of the war, evolving into Bomber Command's elite precision strike unit. They experimented with new targeting techniques, tested larger bombs, and undertook missions against targets deemed too difficult or too important for conventional squadrons. In 1944, they successfully attacked the German battleship Tirpitz with enormous tallboy bombs designed by Barnes Wallis, finally sinking the ship after years of failed attempts by conventional forces. Guy Gibson did not survive the war. He was killed in September 1944 when the Mosquito fighter bomber he was piloting crashed in Holland. He was 26 years old. Many of the other Dambusters also died in subsequent operations. Les Knight was shot down over the Netherlands in September 1943, just 4 months after the dam raid. Of the 133 men who had taken off from Scampton on the evening of May 16, 1943, fewer than half survived to see the war's end. Barnes Wallis lived until 1979, continuing his work as an engineer and inventor throughout the post-war decades. He designed advanced aircraft, developed new weapon systems, and contributed to Britain's aerospace industry. But he never forgot the cost of the raid that had made him famous. In the days immediately following Operation Chastise, when the press was hailing the mission as a great triumph, Wallis wrote that for him, the subsequent success was almost completely blotted out by the sense of loss of those wonderful young lives. He maintained correspondence with the families of crew members who had died, and attended reunions of 617 Squadron veterans whenever his health permitted. In interviews late in his life, he would speak with pride about the technical achievement of the bouncing bomb, but always with sorrow about the men who had carried it to war. The raid on the Ruhr dams occupies a complex position in the history of the Second World War. From a purely military standpoint, its impact was limited. The damage to German war production was significant but temporary, repaired within months at a cost the Nazi regime, with its access to millions of forced laborers, could afford to bear. The loss of 53 highly trained aircrews represented a grievous blow to Bomber Command's strength that arguably outweighed the temporary disruption inflicted on German industry. Had the same aircraft and crews been employed in conventional bombing operations over the course of those 8 weeks of training and preparation, they might have delivered far more tonnage of bombs with greater cumulative effect. But war is never purely a matter of military calculation. The Dambusters raid demonstrated possibilities that had not existed before. It showed that precision attacks on critical infrastructure could be executed successfully despite fierce defenses. It proved that determination, skill, and innovative technology could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. It forced the German military to divert resources to defending targets throughout their territory, never knowing where the next precision strike might fall. It gave the British people a victory they desperately needed at a time when victories were scarce and the outcome of the war remained uncertain. And it established principles of precision bombing that would eventually lead to the development of guided missiles and smart bombs that revolutionized warfare in the decades that followed. The human cost, however, cannot be discounted or forgotten. 53 young aviators died carrying out the mission. More than 1,600 civilians, many of them slave laborers imprisoned by the Nazi regime, drowned in the floods. Thousands more lost their homes, their livelihoods, their communities. The strategic necessity of attacking Germany's war-making capacity must be weighed against the reality that war, even when waged for the most just of causes, inflicts suffering on both the guilty and the innocent. The crews of 617 Squadron understood this. They were volunteers who believed their mission was necessary and right, but they also understood that what they were doing was terrible. They flew into darkness and fire not because they loved war, but because they hoped that by fighting skillfully and courageously, they might help bring the war to an end sooner, ultimately saving more lives than were lost. In the 82 years since that moonlit night in May 1943, the story of the Dambusters has been told and retold in books, films, and documentaries. It has become legend, the brilliant inventor with his bouncing bomb, the heroic young pilots flying at impossible altitude through walls of fire, the massive dams exploding in geysers of water and concrete. The legend is based in truth, but legends inevitably simplify and sanitize. The real story is more complex, more human, and ultimately more moving than any legend can capture. It is a story about young men far from home who volunteered for a mission they knew would be extraordinarily dangerous, who trained until they had perfected skills that seemed to defy possibility, and who flew into enemy fire knowing that many of them would not return. It is a story about an engineer who believed he could invent a weapon that would change the course of the war, who persevered in the face of institutional skepticism and bureaucratic resistance, and who spent the rest of his life haunted by the price of success. It is a story about the immense destructive power of modern war, about technology pushed to its limits, about courage and sacrifice and the terrible choices that nations at war must make. And perhaps most importantly, it is a story that forces us to confront uncomfortable questions that have no easy answers. What is the acceptable cost of military necessity? When does the strategic value of a target justify the civilian casualties its destruction will inevitably cause? How do we honor the courage of those who fought while acknowledging the suffering of those who died? These questions are not unique to Operation Chastise. They echo through every war humans have ever fought. But the Dambusters raid, precisely because it has been so thoroughly documented and so widely celebrated, provides a lens through which we can examine these questions with unusual clarity. On a still night in May, if you stand on the shore of the Möhne Sea and look across the water toward the dam, you can see where the breach was repaired. The stone is slightly different in color, a scar that still marks the structure more than 8 decades after 19 modified Lancaster bombers set out from Lincolnshire to change history. The water is calm now, peaceful, visited by tourists who come to walk along the dam wall and admire the beauty of the surrounding landscape. It is hard, looking at that peaceful scene, to imagine the apocalyptic flood that once thundered through this valley, hard to conceive of the incredible daring it took for young men to fly their heavy bombers at 60 feet in darkness toward this target while German gunners fired at them from point-blank range. But the ghosts are there if you know where to look, in the rebuilt sections of destroyed villages, in the memorials to those who died, in the museum displays that preserve fragments of the Lancasters that never came home. The raid on the Ruhr dams was a military operation, carefully planned and executed according to the brutal logic of war. But it was also a profoundly human story about what people are capable of achieving and what they are capable of enduring when the stakes are high enough and the cause is deemed worthy of the sacrifice. That is why, decades after the last veteran has died and the strategic debates about the raid's effectiveness have been settled by historians, the story of the Dambusters will continue to be told. Not because it is a simple tale of heroes and villains, but because it is a complex story about real people facing impossible choices in the midst of history's most terrible war. A story that still has much to teach us about courage, ingenuity, sacrifice, and the terrible price of victory.